So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Hazem Zohny, who is our is a researcher here at the Institute, and he also works with the Department of Psychiatry, in Oxford. Some of you may recognise Hazem from previous talks, and he's here today to give you an introduction to the key challenges of AI ethics. Hazem, are you ready to go?
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much, Liz, and hello, everyone. I will assume you can hear me and see this introductory slide. So maybe before sort of diving properly in, it's worth just stating what is perhaps fairly obvious, which is that AI is by no means a new thing, right? We've had what's sometimes called symbolic AI, systems that are designed on explicit rules and logical structures. These have been integrated into societies and bureaucracies for decades, right? So think everything from tax software to early chatbots like Eliza. These are from the 1960s. Meanwhile, we have these sort of new systems, so-called deep learning AI, which is based on these types of networks that can learn patterns from data, to put it sort of very roughly. And these have been around for decades as well, but it's only really started taking off this past decade and culminated, much more recently in the kind of generative AI like ChatGPT and Claude and so on. And it's these systems that seem to have really captured the world's attention. And yeah, likely brought many of you here today. And this is just to say, I'll mostly focus on that type of AI. And also to say, a lot of the questions I'll highlight are also not exactly new. They're mostly sort of old questions about power and justice and identity. But it seems like, anyway, this particular wave of AI advances is sort of forcing us to ask these sorts of questions with a kind of a renewed urgency. Okay, so that's sort of where I'm coming from here. So you have these questions about, what happens when we think about putting AI in charge, right? Not just sort of your playlist or your driving instructions, but in charge of, let's say, a whole city. Okay, yeah, like how about an AI for mayor? And this isn't, as you can see, a thought experiment. This is a news story from last year in this town called Cheney in Wyoming in the US. A man named Victor Miller ran for mayor, but his entire platform was that he wouldn't be making the decisions. Instead, he had this custom-built ChatGPT bot that was named VIC, stands for Virtual Integrated Citizen. It's that system, VIC, that would be running the city. That was the platform. And the promise was, well, yeah, I mean, Vic was presented as something that could, process huge amount of information and make these unbiased, data-driven decisions. In fact, if I recall, the campaign slogan was something like, there's a new intelligence in town. Now, in the end, the state election officials got involved. The Secretary of State basically said, "Hold on, our law is pretty clear that a candidate needs to be a person, like a registered voter," which makes sense. And anyway, in the end, they only allowed Miller's name on the ballot, not the bot's. And ultimately, out of some 11,000 votes, Miller and his bot only got 300 and something. Now, while this was sort of a failed attempt to try and run a city or govern a city with an AI, we know that these systems and these so-called large language models, which are an example of generative AI, we know that they are already being used in governance, including reportedly, right, in how the US administration came up with the so-called Liberation Day regime of tariffs. I don't know if you sort of saw that, these types of headlines a few weeks ago, but also like the UK's technology secretary, Peter Kyle, using ChatGPT for science and media advice, and you can find endless examples in the news of government and media figures either sort of getting caught or freely admitting to using these systems to inform their thoughts and opinions. So indirectly, at least, we have a good reason to think that this kind of AI is already influencing those who are in charge of in government. And yeah, I mean, that raises a whole host of questions. But before we get to whether AI should ever sort of directly or indirectly be in charge of something, I think it might be useful to sort of quickly get our heads around what it actually is. What do we even mean when we say something is artificially intelligent? And I don't mean technically here. I mean more so conceptually. So is Vic just really a really advanced calculator, a tool, or is it something else entirely? And while philosophers are often accused of getting too focused with definitions, and in fact, people often dismiss this focus on definitions as just academic. I hope to show you why doing a bit of what's called conceptual analysis can be really central to then thinking about the ethics. So let's start with that. Let's start with what we might mean by this term artificial. I think most of us, including myself, we don't necessarily have a clear, explicit commitment to any particular philosophical view. And this, instead, I think we tend to have these vague intuitions, kind of gut feeling about what artificial really means. And I want to suggest that those intuitions, which we might not, even explicitly think about, these can really color how we evaluate and think about the AI systems we encounter. And so I'm just going to blast through these quickly as we'll come back to them. Don't worry about the specific labels used here. I mean, the names don't actually matter. This is just a kind of a way to put a spotlight on those different intuitions or frameworks that are already out there. So yeah, so first we have what we might call an essentialist view. This says something like, artificial things are basically inferior copies of the real natural thing, right? It's a very old idea. It goes back to kind of skepticism about imitations in general. Then you have a constructivist view, right? This kind of flips the essentialist idea on its head. It says, artificial isn't an insult. It's sort of a legitimate extension of our own human abilities, our reason, our creativity. And finally, you have what might be called a posthumanist view, and this might argue something like, this whole distinction between natural and artificial, it doesn't even really make that much sense. Humans are natural animals, right? And so, aren't the things we build also in some sense natural? And this view focuses much more so on what something does rather than where it fundamentally comes from or what it's made of. So you can already get a sense now of how these sorts of background intuitions or frameworks about what counts as artificial, if anything, can completely change the conversation, right? So, I mean, all that is to say, even before we ask whether AI is intelligent, we're already struggling with whether it is in some sense real enough to matter. And of course, the two ideas are linked, right? So if we move on to intelligence and unpack what some people mean by it, and I mean, I can't emphasize how much this is a live debate right now. So you might have heard people call large language models like ChatGPT stochastic parrots. The argument there is that they're basically, powerful mimics, right? They're matching patterns without any real understanding. At the same time, you have some cognitive scientists and philosophers pushing back and saying, actually, aren't our own brains, our own human brains, aren't they also on some level extremely complex prediction machines. So with that sort of very live debate going on, let me just also quickly sketch these four ways of thinking about intelligence, and look at this behavioralist approach, right? So this is kind of tied to this classic Turing test idea. If it acts intelligent, you should treat it as intelligent. The internal state, or what's happening under the hood, that doesn't matter. It's all about sort of observable performance. Next, you have a cognitive view that says something like, no, the internal process is what matters. And from this perspective, true intelligence is about internal capacities like reasoning and planning and problem solving, and not just sort of surface level pattern matching. You have also what's sometimes called embodied intelligence, and that argues something like, look, thinking, real thinking, requires a body to interact with the world, right? True intelligence in this sense can't exist in some purely digital vacuum. It needs to be grounded in physical experience. And then you have other views that focus much more sort of on what sometimes called the kind of phenomenological experience, right? So this is more about the inner experience or consciousness, right? It asks questions like, is there somebody home? Is there a subjective felt experience behind an AI's actions? So just as with artificial, you can see how the definition of intelligence we choose can have these fairly significant consequences about how you just about your basic attitudes to this whole conversation around AI. Okay, so I mean, I've very quickly tried to unpack these two big separate concepts, artificial and intelligence. Let me put them together and see how they might work in practice. So yeah, we can see how these ideas kind of build into these three, by no means kind of exclusive, but three totally different ethical lenses for thinking about an AI system like ChatGPT, depending on kind of where you're coming from. So you have on the left side this ChatGPT as a pattern matcher, and that would be basically what you get when you combine the essentialist view, the AI, this view that AI is an engineered mimic with a kind of a behaviorist idea of intelligence. So if you believe ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or what have you is just generating patterns without understanding, then you can see how this would sort of position you so that the ethical focus becomes largely about use, right? The key question there is what happens to us when we start relying on a system that produces plausible language, but that has no real grasp of truth. On the other hand, if you lean more towards a constructivist view that AI is a kind of a legitimate human extension and see its intelligence as something that emerges from our interaction with it, right? Including the training of that system, you get a fairly different perspective, right? So this is the human extension framework in the middle. And here, the ethics become a lot more relational, right? The important question isn't so much, what is it, but what does it do to our relationships? What responsibilities do we have when it starts shaping our thoughts, our conversations, and our creative work? And finally, if you take kind of that more radical post-humanist approach and combine it, let's say, with the phenomenological questions of consciousness that some might associate with intelligence, you get this third very different framework, which is a language model as a potentially conscious entity, right? And if that's sort of something that you're open to or that you're going to, for whatever reason, biased towards, you can see how that would sort of shift the ethics completely to other questions like the moral status of these systems. It's not just about how we use them or how it relates to us, but about what it might be itself, right? So the question becomes, should we treat it with a kind of precautionary respect, just in case there's someone home? And by the way, I'm not suggesting you should take seriously the idea that large language models are conscious, although increasingly some philosophers do argue we should be more concerned about the prospect of AI welfare, especially if these systems become all the more complex. But anyway, as you can see, sort of, yeah, you have one system here and three fairly different ethical worlds. And the world you end up in could depend to a large extent on these starting conceptual assumptions. And this brings us to what might be kind of the single most important point here, which is what we say AI is shapes, or to some extent anyway, what we think we should do with it. Okay. So yeah, we've been exploring these conceptual differences. I would emphasize these aren't neutral academic labels, right? When we define something, we're assigning it a role, we're assigning responsibility, and we're deciding whether it's legitimate or not. So the act of defining here, including the question of who gets to define, these are in some sense acts of power because they can shape what we think is relevant. And I'll come back to that point a couple of times. And it's worth saying, like, there's a fairly dark history with this sort of thing, right? When we've tried to scientifically define human intelligence in the past with things like craniology and culturally biased IQ tests, it was never really just about science. You know, these definitions were used to serve various political agendas, in some cases to justify eugenics, to justify racist immigration policies. And today, you could say there is some risk of repeating a similar pattern with AI. For example, if we frame AI as being just stats, or even as this one venture capitalist, Mark Andreessen, was sort of often commenting on AI, the way he put it is no more special than a toaster. If that's your framing, you can see how that can politically and socially license the rapid deployment of AI with perhaps minimal oversight. It makes it easier for developers to argue that we only need to worry about technical performance, not deeper ethical issues, because it's just a tool or just a toaster. On the other hand, if we call it truly intelligent, that begins to potentially support claims for the system's autonomy or some kind of autonomy or some kind of rights. Whilst if we frame it as some sort of mysterious alien mind or alien intelligence, you can see how that could easily fuel fears and calls for extreme precautionary regulation. And you see this sort of conceptual conflict playing out in the real world right now. So for instance, the EU AI Act tries to avoid this quagmire by just focusing on the risk level of using AI in specific contexts, and is just not interested in its inner state. Meanwhile, corporate policies, they typically just default to treating AI as a simple tool rather than some kind of co-creator, let's say. And this has implications for the design questions that AI engineers face, right? So should ChatGPT constantly remind you it's a bot? Should we make it sound more human if it's going to be more helpful in that way? Or does that carry some serious moral risk, let's say? Okay, all of this has been kind of conceptual groundwork. For the rest of the time, I want to use this understanding to look forward and sort of shift from questions of what is it to what does it do. And to do that, let me suggest we think about the ethics here on three distinct levels. So this is the framework I'll use. to make sense of the ethics of AI, we can sort of zoom out to whole systems, down to our institutions, and then right into our personal experience. So that biggest outermost circle, society-wide ethics, this is where we ask kind of big, foundational questions. How is AI reshaping power dynamics or justice or inequality, the future of democratic life, or not to mention life under more autocratic regimes? Then we zoom in a layer to institutional and professional ethics. So this is about our kind of daily structures, our workplaces, schools, hospitals, court systems. And the questions here are more concrete, right? So how should a hospital responsibly integrate an AI diagnostic tool? Who is ultimately accountable for decisions that are made with the help of an AI system? And then finally, we zoom right into the core to personal and relational ethics. And this is about us as individuals. How does interacting with these systems affect our identity, our autonomy, our ability to trust, and our sort of most intimate relationships? And I guess the most important takeaway here is that each level reveals a different kind of ethical tension. And that really no single perspective is likely kind of to be sufficient on its own. So you can't fix the societal problems without understanding how they're built into our institutions. And you can't understand that without knowing how they affect individual people. So let's start with the biggest circle and work our way in. Okay. Now, at this level of ethics, it's really about, as I said, it's really about power, it's about legitimacy, and it's about who gets to be the author of these sorts of collective futures that, we're often talking about in the context of AI. So it's not just sort of a simple calculation of harms and benefits. And so one way to think about it is this: even if you're, very optimistic about AI being a force for good, you might still be, fairly uncomfortable with the fact that only a handful of very powerful companies and research labs are the ones largely steering this technology, often with very little public input or democratic oversight. And these actors, they openly claim that their systems could be massively disruptive, even in the best case scenario. So the ethical issue at this level isn't just, is the technology safe? It's also, is this entire process legitimate, right? Who gave that tiny minority the right to reshape society on our behalf, assuming you sort of take seriously their claims about how disruptive these technologies may become? And of course, there's another side to this. We also have to be really careful not to fall into what some people might call, the ethics as obstruction, right? So in the name of caution, we could end up gatekeeping technologies that might actually, radically democratize knowledge or make our systems more just. So imagine if access to top quality legal or medical advice or truly personalized education could be scaled dramatically, not just for the wealthy, but really for anyone with a web connection and a smartphone. Is it ethical to delay those potentially very real benefits to millions, maybe billions of people, just because the architecture for large-scale decision-making isn't quite right? And that kind of creates a bit of a bind. We have to sort of walk this fine line between, on the one hand, potentially reckless deployment, and on the other hand, a kind of paralysis that just tries to preserve an already fairly unequal status quo. And that forces us to sort of look more closely at the kind of power we're dealing with. Skip to this slide. And that focus, I'd say that kind of the crucial ethical issue at this society-wide level, it isn't that we might explicitly or intentionally hand over governance to machines, as in sort of with the case with Vic, where it seems very intentional. In most cases, the worry is that no one makes that single direct decision. Instead, what could happen is that as we scale up automation, in policing and loan applications and public services, these systems just start to shape outcomes in ways that feel like governance, not because an AI is making some kind of sovereign decision, but because humans have designed and delegated tasks to systems that increasingly define how choices are made, often without any real oversight. And I think there is a novel worry here, and it's tied to speed. So with symbolic AI, as in traditional handcrafted rules and logical structures, as I'd mentioned, I mean, that's been integrated into societies for decades, but it's been a relatively slow process, or at least slow enough that you could hope to detect and maybe reverse unintended consequences. Whilst this latest wave seems to be moving, incredibly fast, and it's being propelled by some worrying dynamics. Essentially, AI companies and even entire countries are locked in to a kind of high stakes arms race. There's a widespread belief, it might be false, but it certainly seems widespread, that the first group to develop truly superior AI will gain some kind of decisive, maybe even insurmountable economic and military advantage, such that there's a true winner-take-all situation. And that's often where the conversation about existential risk comes in, right? The fear for some is that an uncontrolled, super intelligent AI created in a reckless race to the top could pursue its own learned objectives in ways that are catastrophic for humanity, whether by design or by accident. And it is this fear of an existential catastrophe, ironically, I would say, that in part fuels the intensity of what's sometimes been called a security dilemma. Even if one company or one country wants to proceed with caution, it can't trust its competitors to do the same. So they end up whereby kind of the rational choice for everyone is just to race ahead because the perceived risk of falling behind is considered greater than the risk of building something that can endanger us all. And that's a pretty uncomfortable dynamic to be in. Anyway, the key question, sort of to take from this societal level, it isn't just who is in charge, it's what kinds of power are being created, and did the people affected by them ever actually get a say? So that it's very much about the architecture of these large-scale decisions. Okay, with that in mind, let's zoom in a layer. And now we're asking, how does AI reshape expertise and responsibility in places like hospitals, schools, workplaces? And there are a few key tensions here worth highlighting. The first is this challenge of delegation without transparency. Even when an AI performs really well, professionals, you might worry, can end up delegating tasks to systems without any clear sense of what they're actually giving away. So a doctor might follow an AI's recommendations, but can they reconstruct its rationale? Do they even feel the need to do that? And you can see how over time there's this potential to create what's sometimes called epistemic opacity. Professionals start treating the AI's output as the default, not because they necessarily agree with it, but because they can't meaningfully question it. And that fundamentally changes what it means to exercise professional judgment. And this leads you, or leads us rather, to this second issue worth highlighting here of shifting accountability. So when an AI-assisted decision goes wrong, who takes the blame? You might say, it's the human professional using it. but maybe ethically or certainly psychologically. I think that line gets very blurry if a judge, say, uses an AI risk score that turns out to be biased. The reasoning itself was outsourced, but the blame might still solely fall on the human. And this puts professionals in a pretty awkward bind. Either they override the system and risk being scrutinized for, going off protocol, or they follow it and, risk being responsible for a decision they didn't fully control. And a third, more subtle risk here worth highlighting, we might call it institutional value drift, right? So AI systems work best at the moment anyway on things that are easy to quantify. And so you might worry that without anyone necessarily intending it, the institutions that use them might start to favor, they might start to favor those measurable aspects of the work, right? So hospitals might start to optimize for things like patient throughput, schools for test scores, courts for simple consistency. None of these are necessarily bad things, but they might not reflect sort of the full moral mission of these institutions. The values drift, not because people in charge have changed their minds, but because the tools they use quietly reshape what counts as success or good performance. I mean, let me just sort of, before moving on to that last circle, I mean, let's not also forget the other side of this, because yeah, there's this risk, obviously, of romanticizing the status quo, right? Human systems are also pretty opaque, pretty biased, not to mention overwhelmed. In many places, like a rural clinic where there is no specialist, or in an overstretched classroom, AI support might be the difference between some care and no care at all. And so there is such a thing as ethical paralysis. And sometimes it may be good ethics also means being able to say, you know what, AI comes with these significant risks, but at least in some contexts, it may still be better than what we have now. And wrestling with this trade-off is precisely what makes the ethics complicated. It forces us to ask these sort of fundamental questions about institutions. Are we at risk of equating intelligence with mere accuracy and speed? Is the very meaning of professional judgment shifting under our feet? And ultimately, what kind of authority are we granting to systems that we might not be able to properly interrogate? Okay, with those questions in mind, let's zoom in one last time to that final innermost circle, personal and relational ethics. And the questions on this slide, I mean, the ones we're about to discuss, these are by no means exhaustive as with the ones before. They're really just meant to illustrate the kinds of tensions that emerge at this personal level. And the core tension is this, right? When we interact with an AI system, like a large language model, we often experience it as a kind of presence, right? Something seemingly attentive, available, engaged. But on the other hand, for most of us anyway, we also think that technically this is just a process, right? It's just input, pattern recognition, and output, and that gap between presence and process is where a lot of the ethical challenges reside, and it brings up this issue of relational ambiguity. So imagine you say something to an AI therapist and it replies, "Yeah, that sounds really difficult. I'm here with you." If that response feels helpful, should we care whether it comes from genuine empathy or just well-tuned probabilities? And this is very much where our definitions from the start of the talk become crucial again. So a behaviorist might say, look, if it behaves like it cares and the interaction is supportive, then it simply is meaningful, right? That's all there is to it. Well, someone else might say, no, if there is no inner awareness on the part of this AI, then actually this care is fake and potentially deceptive. So your theory of mind here, including whether something that is artificially intelligent can have a mind, very much can shape your ethics here in this obvious way. And that, I mean, all that ambiguity also has, implications for things like trust. So normally trust involves some kind of vulnerability based on someone's intentions, right? But with AI, you're trusting something that is more like a system's design, right? Not so much its character. So is that still trust, or is it some new kind of curated dependence? And then finally, there's this issue of the simulation of the self. So many of these language models, in this case, are trained to mirror our language, well, your specific language and your specific tone. And this can feel incredibly supportive, but it also creates this strange, maybe flattening effect where you're only ever talking to something that is like an echo of yourself. And sort of heavy users of large language models might have had this worry themselves. And anyway, ultimately, the point here is, whether we accept these systems into our emotional world may depend less on what they do and more on what we think they are. And that's why this level is so personally revealing and so ethically fraught. Okay, so I mean, I've kind of blasted through these different levels, society-wide, down to institutions, finally to our personal lives. We've seen that the questions we ask and the answers we find often depend on how we're framing the system in the first place. So the natural question is, how can we think through these complex situations in some kind of structured way, especially when there's just sort of, when there's no clear, easy answer. So in this slide, I'll suggest one possible approach. I think about it as a simple scaffold for ethical reflection. It's not meant to be some kind of grand moral theory or a checklist that's designed to spit out the right answer. It's just a practical tool for organizing thoughts and holding multiple perspectives in view at once. And it has three parts. First, we can look at impact. This is the most kind of direct question, what actually happens in the world because of these systems. This includes the obvious outcomes like efficiency gains or clear harms, but also subtler ripple effects like whether trust is eroded or how our relationships change. Second, we can analyze norms, what values, social expectations, or professional standards are being challenged or reinforced. For instance, if schools rely on AI marking tools, what happens to our norms about the role of a teacher and what good feedback looks like? And third, we can examine the thought framing, and this is very much about paying close attention to the language and metaphors we use. Do we call an AI a tool, a colleague, a partner, a black box? These frames really matter because, as we've seen, they shape the kinds of ethical questions we even sort of consider to ask. And for those of you who will be joining for the rest of other seminars that are part of this series, we'll be looking at sort of other domains of AI ethics. Yeah, you might be interested to keep this sort of simple scaffold in mind to think through some of the issues that come up. And just to sort of wrap up, I will try and put this into practice very quickly by coming back to the story at the beginning with Vic, the AI mayor. So first, impact, right? So the potential upside here might be significant, right? The promise is, faster, more data-informed decisions, potentially leading to more efficient city services. But this immediately also raises these questions of whose values is the system optimizing for? Of course, we can and should ask these of any political figure, human or otherwise. The difference here is what happens when that representative is effectively a piece of software that's ultimately designed and controlled by a private company with its own commercial goals. Now, there are many, many more questions to ask here about impact, right? From how the AI could handle a novel crisis, whether it could actually reduce human bias, say in city contracts, how it might affect citizens' feelings of representation, cybersecurity issues. And just being able to identify those questions is a difficult task in itself. It requires actually reaching out to stakeholders, to community members, to the developers to actually uncover what is at stake. So it's by no means a purely armchair theorizing type of process. And then if we move on to norms, an AI mayor forces us to kind of re-examine our traditional ideas about democratic representation. It challenges the long-held norm that a public official must be a human person. This isn't automatically a bad thing, but it does raise these new questions. For example, how does accountability function when your mayor doesn't have personal emotions or a career to protect in the same way a human leader does? Could that lead to more objective, less self-serving decisions, or does it create an accountability vacuum we can't quite fill? And finally, with thought framing, as I mentioned, I look at the language used to present vague words like unbiased, efficient. These can be incredibly powerful. This kind of framing certainly lends itself to thinking, or rather encouraging us to trust the system's output, perhaps seeing them as purely objective. And the point of this lens isn't to say that that's inherently deceptive, but more so to remind us to ask, what does this framing of, unbiased and efficient, what does that framing draw our attention to, and what might it be drawing our attention away from? So it helps us sort of pause and question the system's legitimacy rather than sort of accepting it at face value. Okay, that was a bit quick. Hopefully gives you a concrete sense of how this simple scaffold can help us sort of start to map out the different layers of the ethical challenges given a particular case. Okay, we've covered maybe a lot of ground. I will just put this slide here. As a kind of summary. All right, I want to sort of leave you with these 4 questions that kind of summarize what we've covered. So the first, we always have to ask that foundational question of power: who gets to define what intelligence is and what that definition entitles them to do? Second, at the institutional and societal level, what kind of values and norms are potentially silently being built into these systems, and how do we hold them accountable? Third, as we saw in our personal lives, when is the simulation of care, empathy, or understanding ethically legitimate, and when does it deceive or displace something vital? And finally, kind of linked to the first question, but also underpinning all of this is, how does our language about AI, the very words we choose, shape public trust, oversight, and even our resistance to it?